Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 at the age of 19, dropped out of Stanford, and spent the next decade convincing the world she had reinvented blood testing. At its peak, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Holmes herself was worth an estimated $4.5 billion on paper, making her the youngest female self-made billionaire in American history. Then it collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully, but completely. What makes her story worth studying is not the fraud itself. It is the sequence of decisions that made the fraud feel necessary, then survivable, then permanent, until none of those things were true anymore. Betting the company on technology that did not exist, Holmes built Theranos on a single central promise: that a proprietary device called the Edison could run hundreds of diagnostic tests from a single finger prick of blood, faster and cheaper than any existing lab. The problem was that the Edison could not actually do this. The physics of blood volume alone made many of the promised tests unreliable at such small sample sizes. Her own scientists told her this. She pushed forward anyway. The reasoning, at least in the early years, seemed almost noble. She genuinely believed the technology would catch up to the vision. Silicon Valley had a long tradition of building the pitch before building the product. It had worked for others. It did not work here, because blood diagnostics are not software. Wrong results do not crash an app. They send patients to unnecessary surgery or let cancer go undetected. The gap between vision and reality did not close. It widened, hiding the Edison's failures behind a wall of secrecy. When the Edison consistently failed internal validation tests, Theranos did not pause operations. Instead, Holmes built one of the most aggressive secrecy cultures in Silicon Valley history. Employees signed suffocating non-disclosure agreements. Teams were siloed so that no single person could see the full picture. Whistleblowers were threatened with lawsuits. The reasoning was competitive. Holmes genuinely feared that Walgreens, Safeway, or a larger diagnostics company would steal her approach if she opened the kimono too early. Secrecy is normal in tech startups. What it did here was something different. It prevented the kind of external scientific scrutiny that could have forced a course correction before real patients were harmed. The secrecy was not protecting an innovation. It was protecting a fiction, and it gave that fiction years of extra life. Building a board of generals instead of scientists, Holmes assembled one of the most impressive boards in corporate history. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, William Perry, statesmen, diplomats, former secretaries of defense. What the Theranos board almost entirely lacked was anyone with serious expertise in diagnostics, laboratory medicine, or clinical science. Holmes chose her board for credibility and access, not oversight. The reasoning was rational from a fundraising perspective. These names opened doors. They signaled legitimacy to investors who could not evaluate the science themselves. But a board exists partly to ask hard questions. Nobody in that room was equipped to ask whether the Edison's sensitivity rates were clinically acceptable. The prestige board became a prestige shield, and it held for years longer than it should have, letting Ramesh Balwani run operations. Holmes brought in Sunny Balwani, her romantic partner, as president and COO of Theranos. Balwani had no background in medicine or laboratory science. He was aggressive, dismissive of dissenting employees, and by most accounts made the internal culture significantly more hostile. Scientists who raised concerns about test accuracy were not heard out. They were managed out. Holmes later, during her criminal trial, attempted to distance herself from Balwani's decisions and described their relationship in deeply troubling terms. But for years, she had given him enormous operational authority over a company where the operations were the problem. The consequence was a culture where the people most qualified to identify the fraud were the people most afraid to speak. Deploying to Walgreens before the product worked, In 2013, Theranos launched its testing services in Walgreens locations in Arizona. Real patients began receiving real results from the Edison. The company was not ready. Internal documents later revealed that Theranos had been secretly running most of its tests on commercially available Siemens machines, not the Edison, and was manipulating the reference ranges on its own tests to make results appear consistent with industry standards. Holmes made the decision to launch commercially because the partnership was expiring and the pressure to show revenue was enormous. Investors needed proof of concept. Walgreens needed exclusivity to justify the deal. The reasoning was the reasoning of a company that had already overcommitted and could not stop. Patients in Arizona were receiving inaccurate results for HIV, cancer markers, and thyroid conditions. Some had their treatments altered on the basis of those results, dismissing John Carreyrou's investigation as a smear campaign. In 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou began investigating Theranos. Holmes's response was not transparency, it was war. Theranos deployed its lawyers aggressively, pressured sources, and Holmes went on a public offensive, framing the investigation as an attack by threatened incumbents trying to destroy a disruptive innovator. She appeared on stage at conferences, she gave interviews, she held the line. The reasoning was that she had survived bad press before, and that a sufficiently forceful counterattack might discredit the story before it landed. What she did not account for was that Carreyrou had sources inside the company and documents to match. When his first story ran in October 2015, it did not read like a smear. It read like a case file. The counterattack made her look worse, not better. Continuing to fundraise while federal regulators were already inside. After the Journal story, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services launched a formal inspection of Theranos' Newark, California laboratory. Inspectors found serious deficiencies. The lab was eventually threatened with shutdown. Holmes knew this. While the regulatory process was unfolding, Theranos continued raising money from new investors who were not told about the federal findings. This was not a gray area. It was the kind of decision that transforms a story about a failed startup into a story about criminal fraud. Holmes raised hundreds of millions of dollars from people who deserved to know that federal regulators had found the company's core laboratory to be dangerously deficient. The gap between what investors were told and what Holmes knew became the foundation of her eventual conviction, taking the stand in her own defense. At her 2021 criminal trial, Holmes made the decision to testify in her own defense. It was a high-risk choice that her legal team presumably debated at length. Her testimony introduced a narrative that she had been a victim of Balwani's psychological abuse and had genuinely believed in her technology. The jury acquitted her on some counts, but on the stand, she was also confronted with her own emails, her own presentations, and her own words from years of interviews. Cross-examination exposed the distance between what she had claimed publicly and what she had known privately. The testimony that was meant to humanize her also gave prosecutors hours of material. She was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. Believing the story long after the story was over. The deepest mistake was not any single decision. It was the pattern underneath all of them. Holmes had constructed an identity so completely around being the person who was going to change medicine that she could not separate the identity from the reality. When the technology failed, she did not pivot. She performed. When regulators came, she kept performing. When journalists came, she kept performing. When investors came, she kept performing. The story of Theranos is not simply a story of deliberate deception, though there was deliberate deception. It is a story of what happens when someone mistakes their own narrative for the truth for long enough that the consequences of admitting the gap become unthinkable. By the time the gap became undeniable, it had swallowed everything.